This is a short history of Lancaster West estate in North Kensington in an area called Nottingdale. This is one of the earliest maps we have of the area from 1870, before any of our estate was built. It had been farmland not long before. The first major intervention was the Hammersmith and City Railway that slashed its seemingly indiscriminate way right through the landscape in 1867. The public housing movement began out of the dramatic urban expansion of the Victorian era. Towards the end of the 19th century, philanthropists, reformers and religious groups were recognising the overcrowding, poverty, sickness and immorality in the inner cities. Charles Booth recorded the conditions by colour-coding houses in maps like this one of 1889. We see on the left the dark blue homes of the very poor near Bramley Road through to the brighter coloured yellows of the houses on the hill around St John's Church. Booth recorded terrible hardship just a few hundred yards west of the wealth that radiated outwards from Lansdowne Crescent. By the end of the 19th century, we see the borough's first steps to improve these conditions. The Kensington Baths at Lancaster Circus, the meeting of Clarendon Road, Silchester Road, Lancaster Road and Walmer Road. The Academy School now occupies the site of the baths. At the time, Lancaster Circus was a busy junction where there were many shops, the Lancaster pub and what is now called the Methodist Church. On the 14th of each month, the Grenfell candlelit vigil takes place at this point, outside the Methodist Church. It's a natural focus. I think it's geographically the core of the estate. Just to put this in context, this map shows the lost streets from 1910 overlaid on current buildings in the estate. The density of streets to housing was quite different, and the different parts were much better connected. The names of our present walkways, Hurstway, Testerton and Barrington, were the names of Victorian streets, and the tower was named after Grenfell Road. See too how Bowmore Road has shifted down so as to wend its way round Treadgold House, and what is now the magnificent Talbot Grove House, an area dark blue on Booth's maps, is the site of Talbot Mews, once proudly fronting onto Talbot Grove. The efforts of the Victorian philanthropists such as George Peabody, Charles Booth and Octavia Hill encouraged the government to legislate. The Housing of the Working Classes Acts of 1885 permitted local councils to borrow central treasury funds and to build homes, and also empowered them to force responsibility on rogue landlords to improve their property or demolish. A further act of 1890 allowed them to actually buy these properties, arguably justifiable compulsory purchase. Since the 1860s, mansion blocks had sprung up in the wealthier parts of London. These were townhouses with shared entrance leading to multiple flats. This style of housing became the model of the earliest type of multiple occupancy council-owned homes. Moreland House of 1931, Talbot Grove House 1932 and Bramley House of 1936 were some of the earliest housing blocks to go up in this group. This drawing by the borough engineer is titled Talbot Grove House Clearance Scheme and is of the facade of Moreland House. The building has a simple but dignified appearance, with Georgian windows but a slight nod to modernism. Talbot Grove House was a proud Georgian palace fronting onto Talbot Road. Its exotic gardens are now hidden from the public street, with a group surrounded by Camelford Walk and Clarendon Walk. Bramley House was the third in this group. There are ecstatic descriptions of people moving out of slums. This was paradise. They had flower boxes, gas, electricity, baths, indoor WCs, organised waste collection, coal storage, warmth and privacy. Bramley House took up a site of two clearly unsustainable semi-detached houses with over-large gardens at the corner of Silchester Road, Bramley Road and the railway, which would forever blight that triangular leftover plot of land. There was no building work between 1939 and 1945. The war left many more families in poverty and homeless. This plan shows the area where, in 1944, a bomb demolished a number of homes around Bowmore Road and Grenfell Road. So around 32 temporary prefab homes were built immediately after the war, seen here in this 1947 aerial map. Nearby estates, Barlow House, Alham House and Henry Dickens Court were built in the 50s. By the late 50s, the council was already planning a huge compulsory purchase of the properties in Hurstway and Testerton Street. But Lancaster West's first significant post-war building was in the triangle of land just south of Bowmore Road. Alan Johnson's autobiography in his early years in North Kensington gives us a very realistic picture of the lives of the not-so-well-off. He lived at first in Southam Street, near what is now the site of Trellick Tower. He moved to Walmer Road and eventually met his wife in Camelford Crescent. There are vivid descriptions of the tensions between classes and ethnic groups in Notting Hill in the post-war period. This photo of Southam Street, typical of life in North Kensington, is by Roger Main in 1956 when Johnson was around 6. Partly covered by prefabs and with some houses likely to be damaged by bombs, the first site to be cleared was the area around Grenfell Road where Bowmore House, now Treadgold House, was put up around 1960. With 5-storey balcony access, it was the epitome of modern design. Originally it was entered from the north, from Bowmore Road. Now it's approached via a rather unceremonious side gate because Bowmore Road was relocated to the south of Treadgold House. We can see the L shape of the building and the 1910 street in red to the north of it. The move was to clear away a huge site for the much larger plan to include the new baths, the walkways and Grenfell Tower. Rillington Place was where the infamous Christie murders took place, just opposite the garage at St Mark's Road. A crowd of onlookers gathered at the end of the street as police searched the house number 10 on the 25th of March 1953. In the early 19th century, Nottingdale had been a shanty town of poor housing and piggeries built amidst stagnant water. After the bombing of the Second World War, conditions had got much worse. There was rationing in Britain, and in 1958 Notting Hill became a focus of the race riots. Here the Downing Street demonstration in the aftermath of West Indian Kelso Cochrane's controversial murder. Oswald Mosley stood in the general election in Kensington North in 1959, but thankfully got only 8% of the votes. Work began in the late 50s on the design of Grenfell Tower, the walkways and the Camelford Crescent Clarendon Road end of the estate. Planning was granted in 1970 and building began in 1972. The process was slow because there was still a lot of clearance to be done. The master plan of 1968 was truly groundbreaking. The idea was to segregate vehicles to the perimeter of the site and to underground car parks, leaving housing, a shopping centre, offices and pubs, as well as a swimming pool complex, post office, nursery, elderly people's home and library and a children's home and a petrol station, all linked by raised integrated walkways centred around a public open space. And, in front of the Methodists, what the designers called Church Piazza. We must remember that when this little group was designed, there was a strong post-war movement towards demolition and rebuilding of town centres, a reaction to the perceived slum dwellings. More recently, we've come to know that this was not the fault of the buildings, but the overcrowding and extortion from profiteering landlords such as Peter Ratman. This cross-section by the master planners Clifford Weirden and Associates shows playgrounds, Grenfell Tower, the shopping centre with car parking below, and on the right, the Methodist Church, one of the few old buildings to remain. One architect for the group, Derek Latham, recently told me his part in the story. As a young architect, he worked with Clifford Weirden and was disappointed when the council's borough engineer and surveyor took over the construction after the tower and walkways had been completed. Gradually the council dropped the best bits of the scheme. Clifford Weirden himself was not keen to build the tower and wished to keep the development low-rise, as tall buildings were already becoming unpopular in the 1970s. Mr. Latham had been to Expo 67 in Montreal with colleagues. They were very excited by this Canadian exhibit. To our eyes now, perhaps a crazy pile of boxes, but then a much more interesting solution than the tower block model. Moshe Safdie, the architect, wanted each flat to have a balcony that isn't overlooked, so Mr. Latham's team tried to take something from this and also offer all flats a view of the garden. They fought hard against the council for this, arguing for gradual renewal in the area, not wholesale demolition. Unfortunately, it seemed little was built but the housing, though this was unusual, sensitive and quite original. In this design for the walkways, they rationalised the box scheme they'd seen in Montreal and laid it out in a form of 3 terraces, but they made it more to the scale of a Georgian street. There was also reference to the private Notting Hill squares and the way the spaces between were managed with trees in the centre. This is a lovely impression of what we now have. In this 1960s model, we can see how the top transverse flats bridge over the walkways, leaving gaps between to allow natural light and weather into the raised streets below them, later to become troublesome. The original brief was to make 4 tower blocks like Silchester, but the architects succeeded in this more responsive scheme. The tower was the first part of the development. 80 one-bed flats and 40 two-beds. At 24 stories, it was bulkier and taller than the slightly earlier 4 towers on the GLC's Silchester estate next door. The central boiler for the entire development was in the basement. In situ concrete columns, slabs and precast beams tied the building together. Heating was to be on for 30 weeks of the year. There was gas, many electrical points for a cooker and a fridge and a fuse board, usually in the hall cupboard. It was a world away from housing that residents had come from at that time. The architecture was in a style we now call brutalism, though it was anything but brutal. A warm red brick cavity walling is built between expressed concrete floor slabs. Aluminium windows are generous in size and the flats have a really nice layout, mostly looking out at leafy streets and gardens. The next part of the site to be constructed was the northern end of the group, around Talbot Grove House. In this model, the master plan of 1968, we can see the towers of Silchester Estate beyond, Grenfell to the left, and in the foreground, Talbot Grove and Moorland houses, around which the next phase was to be built. The Westway opened in 1970. It had caused untold damage to the communities in North Kensington, dwarfing anything that bombs could have. The C-shaped building marked in the centre, stage 3, is Talbot Grove House. The blackened buildings, the Methodist Church, Barlow House Flats and Bowmore House, were all that was left in what appears to have been an enormous muddy building site. By the mid-70s, the council engineers and surveyors department had taken over most projects, including the group Cornwall Crescent and Lancaster Road. This is one example typical of Stage 3 group, Talbot Walk on St Mark's Road. The buildings were a mixture of maisonettes on 2 floors and flats. There were 2 corridors, external on the 1st floor and internal on the 3rd floor. The basements again were used as underground car parks. The construction was concrete slab with brick facing and cavity walls below the ribbon windows. This was a large group including Camelford Walk, Camelford Court, the Clarendon Walks and Talbot Walk. This plan is the special children's home built within Upper Clarendon Walk. Small kitchens and bathrooms, each shared between 4 generous bedrooms, opened up to a play space attached at each floor. The planning of this group was similar to that of the walkways, with rather overlong internal streets that led off to flats on each side. Some of these flats have good east-west aspect. Still, the buildings were only partially occupied by the mid-1970s, but almost immediately there were complaints, some temporary, but others would persist. This cartoon from the Residents' newsletter of 1976 satirises the state of the building site. Postmen and even the residents were already finding it hard to locate their flats. Hence the St Bernard's dog donated by the council. The baths were still lying empty and unused. There were miles to carry shopping trolleys. "Never give up" is the caption here. The church is depicted as a first aid post. Exasperated shoppers found only one shop, and it's closed. Getting furniture into the flats was a problem, and it appears that the lift only in Grenfell Tower was already out of order. By 1978, the West London Observer was reporting more serious and endemic problems on the estate. Racial disharmony, mugging, car theft and damage, racist graffiti, and general want of something to do. Many of the residents were relatively poor, and apart from the children's playgrounds and the pool, there was little for the youth to do. Against this, we must remember the Notting Hill Carnival. It had been a regular event since 1966. And this went some way towards redressing the balance with the white population's understanding of Caribbean culture. The aerial photograph taken from the tower in 1978 shows the chaotic state of the site. Just right of the church, we can see the Clarendon Walks, complete and occupied and surrounded by noisy and muddy building sites. To the left of the church, the pitched, low-rise blocks of Wesley Square, and yet without windows. And to the right, the foundations of Verity Close. In the foreground, the Victorian baths, derelict for decades and not to be demolished for another year. It was nearly saved by an attempt at listing, but the council found it to be too expensive to restore. The Kensington new pools were already open close by. There followed a principal change in the way houses were being built in the estate. Modernism had become unpopular as a style, and flat roofs were not installed in the new buildings in what they programmed as Phase 4. St Andrew's Square, Wesley Square by Farron and Grimshaw, Verity Close and Cambourne Mews all have traditional pitched roofs. These were even added to the entrances to Camelford Court, an otherwise rectilinear concrete flat-roofed structure. Verity Close and Cambourne Mews were the last housing to be built on our site by 1980. During the 1980s and 90s, much was done to improve the security of the buildings throughout the estate. This was a reaction to complaints by the residents. Enclosed porches were added with entry phones. The walkways were roofed over, and partitions were installed to break up the long corridors. Cockroach infestations were tackled. Basement car parks were converted into studios to let below Barrington Walk, and similarly for self-storage units below the Camelford Group, because the garaging was also not secure. In January 2015, the new leisure centre by LA Architects was opened, and shortly after that, the Aldridge Academy by Studio E Architects, the latest building in the group. On the 14th of June 2017, there was a fatal, tragic fire in Grenfell Tower. The Academy is temporarily closed, and the tower enveloped in hoardings. So much of what was originally intended didn't come to pass. But now there's an opportunity to fulfill the vision. Shops, playgrounds, green spaces and amenities, and flats where the services work to fully modern standards and to be maintained that way. Homes the residents can be proud to occupy with a fully thriving and valued community.